March 1965. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many protesters began to lead a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, with the aspirations of having truly equal voting rights for the first time in history. Throughout this month, the protesters, who are blacks, whites, males, and females, are met with resistance and hostility by the local police force. Although they face violence and hate, the protesters persevere for what they believe in. This is the March on Selma. On July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed by the current president, Lyndon B. Johnson, which outlawed discrimination based on ethnicity. At this point, African Americans had a constitutional right to vote, but realistically, that right was often obstructed using many different tactics, including violence. Naturally, this was a major point in the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was born Michael King Jr., and he adopted the name Martin after the German Protestant Martin Luther. As a child, Martin was very gifted in school. He skipped 2 grades and attended college at the age of 15. Martin obtained a degree in sociology in 1948 and a PhD in 1955. Following in his father's footsteps, Dr. King began to fight racial prejudice. Before Martin was the leader, the movement was sparked when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on an Alabama public bus. Rosa was jailed and fined for her actions. This led to the Montgomery bus boycott. In the coming years, Dr. King would begin to drive the movement. In 1963, he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C.
Will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood? I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by
The next move in the fight for fair voting rights was the March on Selma.
Of this city, and everybody in the white power structure of this city must take a responsibility for everything that Jim Clark does in this community. It's time for us to say to these men that if you don't do something about it, we will have no alternative but to engage in broader and more drastic forms of civil disobedience in order to bring the attention of the nation to this whole issue in Selma, Alabama.
Throughout March 1965, there were 3 marches. The first attempted march was planned for March 7th, which is commonly known as Bloody Sunday. 600 protesters gathered in Selma with the intention of marching more than 50 miles to Montgomery, Alabama. Just as the marchers were about to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, they were met by a force of local police officers and state troopers. The troopers ordered that the marchers must turn around and stop the protest. After the protesters refused, the police became violent. Tear gas was thrown into the crowd, and many people were brutally assaulted.
I remember so well when we arrived at the top of the bridge. Down below we saw a sea of blue. Alabama state troopers.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks, and they came toward us.
Advance toward the group, see that they disperse.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought it was my last demonstration.
Cheyenne and I went to the Edmund Pettus Bridge there where I turned around and left Cheyenne. Simply because I'm telling you, I was afraid.
A 26-year-old preacher named Jimmy Lee Jackson was beaten and shot twice. Jackson was rushed to the Good Samaritan Hospital instead of the nearest hospital in Selma because they feared he would not be treated. He passed away 5 days later. After the failure of the first march, the protesters regrouped on March 9th to make a second attempt. This is referred to as Turnaround Tuesday. As the marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were once again met by swarms of police. At that point, Dr. King borrowed a bullhorn from the officers to say that the march would be put on hold, and he asked that everyone join him in a prayer. Unfortunately, that night, another protester by the name of James Reeb was beaten and murdered. Once again, the march was unsuccessful. Alabama state officials tried to stop the march from going forward any longer, but there was a court order that demanded they must permit the march. Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson also wanted to support the marchers. Johnson pledged his support on national television, saying he was introducing new voting rights legislation in Congress.
To shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. There is no cause for pride in what has happened in Selma. There is no cause for self-satisfaction in the long denial of equal rights of millions of Americans.
The final march to Montgomery began on March 21st. Around 2,000 supporters set out that day. Under the support of President Johnson, the marchers were protected by the U.S. Army and National Guard. Over the course of the march, the demonstrators moved from 7 to 17 miles a day. Each night, the marchers would sleep in fields or in supporters' yards. By the final day, the number of marching supporters surpassed 25,000. Finally, after a month of violence and marching, supporters arrived in Montgomery. As a part of the final rally, King gave a speech on the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery.
How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Because you shall reap what you sow. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yes, that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
About 5 months later, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This act called for the freedom to vote without barriers for all Americans. Although there were casualties, the events of March 1965 have important, lasting effects.